Frankenberger. I use he, him, his pronouns. Professionally, I work as a researcher around and for topics as it comes to fraternity and sorority work, primarily around hazing, women's cycles of hazing and relational aggression abuse. And so this is obviously a really important topic for me and what I care about as a researcher. And I'm excited to be able to share with you all today some of the nerdy data behind what we see. When we often talk about hazing, we think about all of the most aggressive acts of hazing that we often see in the news, right? And you know what these are, those acts that are really over-sexualized, people getting so drugged to the point of death, some of the incredulous acts that are surrounding, vomiting in pools, and then making people lay in them or whatever that might be. And the reality is, while those are the norm of some hazing behaviors, that's really not the core of what exists behind the rationale. And so we're going to talk about today sort of the truth behind this. So like I said, my name's Will. I work around and professionally a national sorority organization, but my work is really on the basis of my own lived experience as somebody who was both hazed and a hazer, spending the time to really unpack and understand what was the motivation behind it. Because as you all know, while not all of us are traditional 18 through 22 or 23-year-old students, we do see pervasive culture that does exist around hazing and things all over the world. So I'm from Chicago originally. I'm a huge Chicago Cubs fan, so don't hold that against me, my Cardinals fans here. But I will tell you, it's really interesting. Every time after the first game, many Major League Baseball teams actually engage in an effort where new players are required to dress up in silly costumes and parade through teams. Some of those are really meant to be demeaning towards the player, and there's been an ongoing conversation of, is that an act of hazing or not? And so we see a lot of the preservation of that, but I want you to know it's not always the most aggressive ways that we see it. So what I want you to do for a second is if you would go into the chat feature, we talk about hazing from a really legal perspective. So I would love to know from you, if you take a second into the chat feature, how would you define hazing to an 11 or a 10-year-old, right? How would you define this act of hazing somebody to a small child? What do you think some of the language you would use would be? So we'll wait a second and go ahead and put that into the chat feature. Yeah, Tori said an act of bullying. That's right, Tori. And I think that that's an understandable term for our students. Jason said making someone do something embarrassing to prove they're committed to a group. Yep, we would absolutely understand that from a small child perspective. What else might be there? Oh, somebody sent me a message that said making another person just feel icky. I love that. Icky is absolutely right. So as you're thinking about these concepts that come in, I want, somebody else just sent me another one that said, making somebody prove they're valuable as opposed to believing their value. Okay, a little bit philosophical for a 10-year-old, but I hear what you're saying, I get it. Ashley said a form of bullying and forcing people to do things they don't want to do, but feel pressured to. Yeah, so here's the thing. We really struggle when we often talk about bullying, if something is a bullying behavior or a hazing behavior or not, because we really have a hard time admitting what's there. Matt said using pressure to force people into doing something dangerous or embarrassing to be a part of the group. Yes. So here's the thing. We, even in some of these descriptions, are using those concepts of dangerous or force or what it is. And it's ultimately what a lot of you said, which is embarrassment. It's doing something and showing somebody they must do something with them. So when we look at these definitions and how we talk about it, there's one word that is usually inherently missing in the process, and it's the concept of power. So there's a lot of conversation that we have to have with people in trauma and in relationships, and even in the work of hazing, about the concept of power. What many of you described is the definition of power. It is assuming the right to control a person. It is telling somebody what they must wear, when they must do something, what they must do to be a part of the group. In a lot of arguments in a lot of places, our society is built in power, struggle, and structure. Our country was founded by historically white men. They perceived what the privilege of women and people who were non-white should be in this country, and maybe arguably still do today. We have structures and power places that exist all around, as men compared to women, as women compared to men. We see power as faculty over students. We see power as your support staff to your student org. There's a component of power in what we do that is the right to control another person. We often really, in the challenge in our organizations, whether you're in fraternity or sorority or a different org-based group, is we have a different kind of connotation. I often hear student organizations, whether they're fraternities or sororities or sports teams, talk about we provide empowering spaces. We are super nerdy D&D fans. We are all Dungeons and Dragons fans. We empower other nerdy Dungeons and Dragons fans to be together. That's great, but how are you actually empowering them versus overtly using power against them? Okay, because the opposite of power is empowerment. And empowerment is the opposite of this. It really allows complete responsibility for the choices made by oneself in order to claim their rights and control. That sounds like a more healthy and holistic way to do what we do. Now, there are obligations of what we do compared to what empowerment would be, or power, right? You have to pay your tuition to stay a student at UMSL. That's not a power grab. That is what you have to do. That's an obligation of being a student, right? But how you pay it is where the university may empower you. They may say you have a payment plan. You can pay with a check. You can pay from a bank. We have a work study option. They give you the opportunity or the choice to make some decisions about what's there for you. So while there's an obligation, it's allowing you the responsibility to decide what it might be. This is really imperative for us to remember as we work with our newest members in our organizations. We often bring them in to onboard them and guide them to what is the ways of our organization without failing to remember there's also the ways of the person. At the end of the day, all of our organizations exist because we're in the business of people. The organization doesn't exist if people are not there. And so we have to find ways to use empowerment to drive them to make the choice, to make the organization something they feel both committed to, engaged with, and that they can have the ownership of what the experience ought to be. So if the simplest version, we break it down, power is the concept of breaking people down. Empowering is what we use to build people up. Many times, and there's an old narrative, especially for any military people on the call, you probably have heard this. We often use the term, we have to break you down to build you back up in the way that we want you to be. That's simply not real. That's simply a false narrative that justifies why it's okay. That would be like saying, I'm going to date a new partner, and before I'm kind to them and want to marry them, I'm going to bring them through a really terrible set of circumstances to break them down, to make them feel less than, to make them undervalue themselves, to engage in acts that they are not comfortable with, so that I can build them back up with that in mind. Quite frankly, if you look at the history patterns of abusive relationships, of groomers, you look at the pattern of any in sex work, right? People that engage in that kind of activity, you will find that is very, very characteristic as I break you down to build you back up in the game of loyalty from me into us. And that's how we actually start to then breed really unhealthy habits. But if our students are coming into our organizations, our sports teams, our clubs, our fraternities, our sororities, or whatever, they should be coming in with the ability to be built up first, as opposed to be broken down. So here's why this matters for our newest members in particular. Our newest members in our organizations, whether they're new members in fraternities and sororities, or at a fair, we bring in a bunch of new students to join our club or our committee, they are joiners. That's why they signed up, to be a joiner. So what they're seeking in that group is social approval. And I know there's a lot of narrative right now about people are not joiners and people don't want social approval. And I will tell you, the research based both in sociology and in the work world and HR and other areas that I study, it's simply incorrect. We all seek a desire to be approved, whether that's by our boss, by our professor, by our partners, by our family, by our friends. It's a natural human instinct. It leads to the concept of what Maslow would call security in oneself and a sense of belonging. It's okay to be the outlier and maybe beat to a different drum, but you still seek the approval of the other different drum beaters. You still seek the approval of others that you are different than them. So when we ask them to do things and engage in activities, we knowingly ask them to do things as us abusing the power that we have over them. So when student organizations and student leaders through the conduct process or other places say to me, but we gave them a choice, they didn't have to participate or not. There is some good in that, but I often value what are the choices. If the choice for me is I can go out to a party and have a great time with friends and be around alcohol that makes me uncomfortable, but that's option one. Or my second option is I'm gonna, light myself on fire. Well, of course, I'm gonna go to the party. And while those are extreme examples, often when we look at choice, it's really participate or not. It's you can either come to this party, alcohol will be present, there will be a culture that may be a little uncomfortable for you, or you could stay at home alone. And inherently, scroll on Instagram or other social medias, watching us be at this party, having a good time together, feeling like you belong just as equally as those that went. Well, it's not really a choice. It's not really a choice. And when we talk about when we give people a choice, we really link a lot of this work to the concept of consent that we do. I can give consent to engage in sexual acts or activities with a partner, but if my other choice is, it doesn't matter if you don't consent, I'm going to still tell people that we did all this and it happens, consent doesn't matter at that point because my choice is not awesome. And it's not something that is ultimately building me up. It is intended to break me down. And so as you think about the options that you give to new members, and I get it, there's a concept now of like, well, what isn't hazing? I think that that's a little extreme. We know the difference of what it is, but just asking yourself the question, what if somebody didn't want to participate in this scavenger hunt or in this mixer or in this meeting with another group? What if they weren't comfortable coming in person to our meeting because COVID is still real for them and they might be an at-risk population? How do we still build them up and give them a sense of belonging without giving them a choice that says, don't worry, we'll waive the membership obligation for you. You don't have to participate. Because we think that's the right choice, but in reality, we're not creating a sense of belonging. And our newest members, they're joiners. They're seeking belonging. And so we have to be really careful of what that means and how we choose to operate with them. So there's 4 motivations for often why hazing exists within organizations. We're going to go through those 4. And the first we're going to talk about is groupthink. Many people have heard about groupthink, especially for my business majors or management majors in the room. Groupthink is a deficient group decision-making process that has a high probability of producing poor or disastrous consequences. We often think groupthink will lead to a sense of cohesiveness, but what cohesiveness actually does is it de-individualizes people. You must think this way, and if you think differently, you're wrong. So when we're in a culture right now where our identities, whether that's based on our race, our ethnicity, our orientation, our gender, our ability status, our veteran status matter to us, we're in a market right now with people who do not want to be de-individualized. They want to be seen. They want to know that their identity matters. And so groupthink is really challenging for that. It also really depends on situational context. Again, I gave you some examples of parties. The same can be true around sexual harassment. It can be true around bullying. It can be true around if you're ever with a group of friends and I personally really like Becky. I love Becky. But if everybody else is talking about how much they hate Becky, it makes that really hard for me to be in that mindset to stand up. It also, for a lot of our groups, provides structural faults. So there's been lots of experiments around groupthink and what can be done. One of the most common one came from an old school show called Candid Camera. It's a great, funny show from back in the old day. And one of the things you'll see in this video clip is just how easy groupthink is to do to manipulate people's behaviors. So I have the video captioned because I know the Wi-Fi sometimes can be a little wonky with the camera, but I think this will give you a pretty good understanding of groupthink in action.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality. A little fiddle. He looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First, he makes a full turn to the rear, and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. See if we can use. Let's see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. Now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? What?
So that's just one example of ways that we often see it happen. And I will tell you, that's groupthink at its finest. So sometimes with our more seasoned members of our organizations, they're kind of like the first guy. They're resistant to change, but enough people will do it that they'll do it. Then we have our joiners of our group who really just want to do right by the organization. That's kind of the second guy. That's the person who just goes with the flow without really asking. The last one is the new member, the joiner. They're there to mimic the behaviors of everybody. And that's why it becomes really imperative that we, one, as an organization, avoid groupthink mentality, but two, identify and empower our newest joiners to not engage in it, to keep our organizations fresh and unique. The next concept that we see as the motivation for why hazing occurs is really internal to the person who is receiving or considering engaging or taking the behavior. This is the concept of perceived influence and need for esteem. So a couple things. We know when a group has high esteem, the individuals that are associated with that group are willing to sacrifice their values. Simultaneously, when somebody's self-esteem is low, their worldview and morality becomes abandoned because the desire to fit in is often more powerful and is an equivalent of denial or death. So there's a real theory behind this called terror management theory that I would encourage you to check out. But this is what happens. When I join a sorority, let's say on campus, that is the top tier sorority, I may have low self-esteem and recognize this is a really prestigious group. I'm going to do whatever they tell me to do because that being a part of that prestigious group is more important to me, because in my head, it will increase my esteem, my self-worth. So I'm going to abandon what it is. We also see people that have a really clear logic on where they are. For example, let's take on a topic like race. I may have a really firm perspective of how I view race in America, what my perspective is. I may be a true fighter for racial equity in this country. I may join a group, let's say a group like, oh, I don't know, the Masons in my local town. And the Masons in my local town might not have a similar push or emphasis on racial equity as I may have. Well, now I have to decide what's important to me. Fighting my battle of racial equity, or being a part of this group that's going to connect me to people and is prestigious that I take a part to be of, without upsetting the apple cart maybe, and saying, why don't we talk about racism more? Why don't we talk about covert systems of racism? What can we do to address this? We've all been in these organizations and struggled. Sometimes when it comes to two organizations together, hey, the men's soccer club wants to do a social with us. They're really fun and popular dudes. We don't love their behavior, but we really want to do the social event or the mixer with them. What do y'all think? And we may have people who go, I don't love that, but it will help more people want to join our group, or it will bring up our social capital or our esteem. So let's do it. So you have to recognize this is why it's imperative when members and new members come into our organization, we spend time and really time identifying who we are as individuals and what does that mean in the greater context of our organization. It's not that we demand people to bend who they are to fit into our chapter, but bringing who they are as assets. And I often describe it as trinkets around your house to improve your chapter, to make it better, to make your organization different, to request or get a different type of student to come in. But you have to remember, when self-esteem is low and the perceived organization authority is high, we start to see decisions that hurt and harm our chapters. In almost every situation I've ever been in with athletic teams, fraternities and sororities, or student organizations where there has been a problem that's needed to be investigated, there's always students who say, I wish I would have stood up for what was right. I wish I would have said. And when I say, why didn't you? It's, I just didn't want to face the backlash of what I was going to get, meaning I abandoned my morality, right? Or my worldview, or I didn't want to lose the access that that group gave me, which is knowing the group has high esteem and not being willing to sacrifice that. These are massive motivators for why individuals endure the behavior, and something we have to be hyper aware of. Here's a concept in a quick video that'll talk a little bit about influence. We won't play the whole thing, but just to kind of see this played out a little bit.
What causes us to make decisions in life? We think the answer is obvious. People know what's good for them. They weigh their options and make a rational decision. When a waiter in a diner asks you if you'd like to order dessert after a meal, the answer is easy. My belly isn't full, plus I love sweets equals, of course I'd like dessert. In other words, you make your own decisions. But what if there's 4 other people sitting at the table with you, and each of them already said no thank you when asked if they would like dessert? Do you change your answer? What's happened here is explained by Jonah Berger, Stanford PhD and professor of marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, in his new book, Invisible Influence: The Hidden Forces That Shape Behavior. In 1951, Solomon Asch set up a similar experiment, asking people which of these lines is the same as this one, A, B, or C. Even though the answer is obvious, many people answered C. How could that be? Just like at the diner, the actual subject of the test was choosing last. Before him were paid actors that gave the same wrong answer, C, C, and C. They influenced the subject to conform just as you conform to decline dessert. Nonsense, you say. That's true for others, but not for me. I am free from influence. I see through the fog of external factors to make objective and powerful decisions. But Jonah Berger shows that these influences are often so strongly embedded in our nature, they're practically impossible to resist. In fact, it is not just humans. Many animals are affected by influence, even cockroaches. In 1969, Robert Zion studied the effects of a crowd on racing cockroaches. The result? Cockroaches ran faster when being watched. How amazing is that? That's not all. The same audience made them run slower when Robert made the race more difficult. Later studies showed the same happens to humans. This means you're better off finding a private spot when you're doing something difficult and gathering around people when you're doing something easy. Jonah explains that this susceptibility to external influences isn't good or bad. If we weren't able to react subconsciously to many different situations, life would be very inefficient. But if we learn how these influences affect us, we can use them to make our lives better and that of those around us.
So that's where we'll pause. But this is the concept of being aware of individual influence on what it has to us. And it's really interesting in this argument that's here, I will tell you, much of what we talk about around hazing and around influence is directly linked to marketing efforts and work that we do around human behavior. So be aware, there's an absolute need for self-esteem and influence, and us as leaders of our student organizations on our campus have to be aware of the influence that we wield and how we use that to build our membership up. The third motivation for hazing that we often see is an obedience to authority. Now, I will tell you, this is a little bit more structured in different organizations than others. This is the concept that we don't want to disappoint those whose acceptance we seek, right? I really love the president of my student club. He's awesome. I really like the way that he does his work. I don't want to do anything that disapproves of him, but there's also some things I don't agree with, and I want to know how to do this. So we don't stand up to the person of power because of our need to join being so high. We see this more in organizations that are linked and structured, right? So for example, if you have a student military organization or a ROTC on your campus, we often see this ability to not stand up. If you have a tiered system, for example, often in our student governments, there's very structured layers of who gets to what. So we may not see that. Fraternities and sororities in their inherent nature are built as tiered, structured systems. And we often are fearful of those because of retaliation or backlash. This is also where we'll see the student kind or the member break free because they don't care about the obedience to authority. So this can have an adverse effect both to build and create a dynamic that is a cohesive team, but also why things get away and occur that we often don't think about. The final motivation that we often see is a tradition or preservation to tradition. Every time I've done an investigation, these are phrases that justify the behavior. We've always done it this way. If I was hazed, she should be too. I did it when I was a new member, you're going to have to do it. Our alums would be pissed if this tradition went away. It's so sacred and special. We often make decisions because they've been handed down to us to make. And you all know this as college students, traditions and preservations often lead to toxic and bad behaviors. Many of you on this call that come from maybe othered or marginalized communities, if we stuck to tradition and preservation, wouldn't even be in college right now, if that's the way we've always done it. I think some of the most lethal sentences in the English language are sentences around, we've always done it this way. And it's imperative to remember, traditions and preservations were those at a time, never for an always. So you can change and build and make new traditions. We have a tradition in the United States of celebrating Columbus Day. As an indigenous human, I'm thrilled to see that that's shifted and moved as we've learned more information to a different kind of tradition and preservation of a different culture. Doesn't mean we can't acknowledge that Christopher Columbus explored great lands. That's true. But at whose cost and what cost, now we can talk about that audience also. So there's always the ability to pivot and move. Ultimately, the tradition and preservations that we are here to maintain, we have to ask, are seeking what purpose and preserving what behaviors? That's ultimately where we get stuck, is it's behaviors that needs to change, that we're scared to change, so we label them as traditional or preservant behavior, and therefore it's okay not to change it. And I will tell you, in the world that we live in, we're working now with you all as Gen Zs and Gen Alphas that are coming up next. They are okay with breaking and getting rid of tradition and preservation. So I'd encourage you and your organizations with the ability to adapt. So we also have to remember that not all hazing is deemed a hazing conversation. And so there's a different concept that we often talk about, which is this concept of relational aggression. And a lot of our organizations and some of the interpersonal conflict that exists is because of relational aggression. So this is using the relationship or the threat of removing somebody from the relationship as the means of harm. There's a really great new age video that I articulated this for everybody. We've all seen Mean Girls. And yes, while mean girl behavior is often associated with the gender as female or girl, this is behavior that exists in every social structure and context. We see this. If you've ever seen the movie Mary Poppins, if you remember in Mary Poppins, George Banks doesn't want to do what the owner of the bank says to do. And by failing to do so, his relationship is hurt by losing his job, by losing his social circle, by losing his friends. We often see this as a retributional act or a retaliatory act when people don't align. So a little bit about relational aggression. It's commonly called mean girl behavior, and it's ultimately aimed at an avoidance of condemning the behavior of a bad key leader or leaders so that others fall in line to what they do. So this can be direct or indirect. This could be having a verbal conversation or directly telling somebody, or using the people and environment around them. It can include things like social exclusion, threatening of friendship withdrawal, the silent treatment, cyberbullying, or lying about somebody else. It also has really big indicators of poor mental health of the person that does it, including, look at the bottom line, sociopathic behavior. So the person who's engaging in relational aggression to cause harm to withdraw, in many studies is often deemed with having similar sociopathic behaviors. And it really can create a lot of mental trauma for the person who's going through that. If you've ever been the part of a campaign where people are talking maliciously about you, it can be really damning. Now, we have to remember that relational aggression, the important pivotal concept here is there is a relationship, because bullying is outright, overt, intentional, exclusionary aggression. In this case, these incidents hurt more because you were my best friend, or we were in this club together. You knew more about me, and you knew hurting our relationship was going to hurt more than a random person bullying me online or to my face. It's different. Which brings us to how we have to talk about and define both hazing and bullying, because they're not the same. So in the research that I do, I've created a continuum here that talks about the difference, because we often use these terms synonymously. And if you go back to define hazing to my 10-year-old niece, many of you talked about bullying. And while they're similar, they are somewhat different. Hazing is an inclusionary act. The intended outcome of the behavior of hazing is to make somebody feel a part of a group. So you must take this test if you want to be in our group. You must agree to take the shot of our chapter if you want to be in the house, right? You have to agree that you're going to do the streaking raid around campus if you want to be in our club, whatever that is. You have to do something that's intended to make you a part of something. On the opposite end of the spectrum is bullying. Bullying is exclusionary to be the case of exclusionary. This is where you might tell somebody, you're just not attractive enough to be in our group. There's nothing you can do, we're just being mean. This is when we start to tell people things and narratives of, we've heard that you're just kind of, for example, a slut, and that's not acceptable behavior that we'll have. Well, it has nothing to do with getting into the group. It is just to be exclusionary in its nature. We don't take men in our organization, only women, right? You're gay, we don't want you to be in our group. Whatever that might be, it's exclusionary in its nature. You have to remember it is possible for both the hazer or the bully to have one core purpose. So for example, in women's organizations, we often see really broken down behavior to get to inclusion. Well, you don't meet our visual standard, or maybe you are a little heavier than the member we would want, or you're just not as fun and outgoing as we normally would take. But if you work on that, we'll make you a part of the group. So the way we're going to do that is give you a big sister who's a lot of fun and make you a part of the group. We see this in student organizations too. You don't have the grades to be in here, and we don't want a low grade point average for our student club. So you're gonna have to get your grades up. Now we're gonna make you come to the meetings because obviously you're bad at time management and you're not very smart, but we're gonna make you come to the meeting so that you can get that up to make you a part of the group. It can fall in both lanes, but you have to look at the purpose. I would also remind you that relational aggression can be both exclusionary and inclusionary at the same time. So it's really imperative as student leaders, you're being mindful of what are the motivations that are driving how your organizations are coming in and how you're using power. If we go back to the concept of power, in this case, are you building somebody up or breaking them down? Bullying at its core is designed to break people down. Hazing at its core is designed to break people down. But if we shift the narrative to being empowering and giving people choice, you will actually find they will come and join and be motivated to stay for reason more than what any broken down effort or abuse of power will cause. So here's my call to actions for you as student leaders in National Hazing Prevention Week and beyond. The first thing you have to do is stop making it a norm in your organizations for members to prove anything. Their worth, their capital, their chillness, their coolness, their desire to join. If you want students to be, let students be. But we often have this narrative of tell us why we should be worthy or why you should be worthy of us. And in reality, we have to flip it, because without new joiners and without our members, we don't exist. So it often comes from proving themselves. I'm encouraging you to remember and understand that a willingness or consent does not mean we're actually getting consent. If a member feels the social pressure and your influence is high enough to do it, go back to the elevator. She will turn, or he will turn, or they will turn and do whatever you ask them to do. Even though you said you don't have to do it if you don't want to, it's that invisible influence that really may be impacting consent, even if you've gotten it. I challenge you and your members to have a culture that questions motivation for every task or request. Just think, what if I had walked into the elevator and saw people facing back and I said, hey, does the door behind me open? Because I only saw one door, right? If we just stop to ask, we might actually be able to change a process. If we are so brave to have our members say, can you tell me why I can't pay my dues via credit card? Well, we never set it up. It doesn't mean we can't, it's just a thing. But without questioning and asking and not getting defensive about the question, but rather hearing it as a clarity, a moment of clearness, right? Brene Brown is the one that says clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Sometimes we must be clear or firm to be able to get to the motivation of what we do. You have to start empowering your members to have choice. Provisional membership times, not being able to serve in leadership roles, all of those things are choices that are there to prove and empower. And I understand sometimes we need people to build up to understand a culture before they're a part of it. And I support that. But how are you framing and building people up to those positions? Maybe it's junior officer roles. Maybe it's roles in training for leaders. Maybe it's saying, hey, if you want to be the president of the chess club, I spend a ton of time doing student space requests. Let me walk you through how to do that in the system so that you see all of that stuff, because that alone might make you go, I don't want to do that, right? So whatever those things are that are giving them the choice, think about how we can do that. And the last component I think that is so huge, so important, is that we teach both conflict management skills. We have to remember conflict is not just conflict management. There's conflict management, resolution, and transformation. And it's important as we have challenges within our organizations that we're able to sit down together and talk about what has happened and how did we get here and how does it get resolved, versus a mass resignation of all the members, the inability to have a space where we can talk about it, or as leaders digging our heel in and assuming our answer is always right. I think by taking these steps, you have a really strong space to understand not only how to avoid conflict, but how to manage it when it occurs. And at the end of the day, hazing, bullying, relational aggression are conflicts themselves that we need and must start to address. I know we have a little bit of time for maybe some questions if you have any, but I want to thank you for giving me your time. I know as college students, as one myself, time is the most precious gift we have. And so please know I'm so grateful for you being here. This is my cell phone number and email address. I am more than happy to talk to any student leaders that have questions or want to unpack some of the content a little bit further. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like. I'm absolutely here to help and learn. And I want to thank, in particular, University of Missouri St. Louis for having me here, and you all for being here to work through this process. So with that, Michaela, maybe I'll turn it over to you to see if there's any questions that came in or anything else that I can maybe further unpack for our group here today before we break.